Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay in getting started. We are now ready for this webinar, and we welcome you to the next Connecting the Dots webinar in our series. Today's topic is the intersection between violent conflict, climate change, and community well-being. This is a partnership of the Militarism Working Group of the Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. We're glad that you're with us for this webinar. Today, we welcome two guests to be our panelists, and they will be introduced in just a moment. Reverend James Bhagwan from Fiji and Svitlana Romanko from Ukraine. And we are delighted that they are able to be with us for this webinar as we connect the dots between climate and militarism and the well-being of communities. Let's open with a word of prayer and then we'll get started. God, thank you for this particular webinar and these particular panelists. And we are wanting to be attentive now to what you would say to us, what we could learn about the connections between violent conflict and militarism and climate change and the well-being of communities. Especially this day, we're going to learn about Fiji and about Ukraine. So guide our hearts and minds that we would learn something new this day. It's in the name of Christ we pray. Amen. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca and Ellen, who will be introducing our guests, I think.
Valerie was going
Valerie,
to
sorry
the
about
first
that.
introduction.
Valerie.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. We're very glad today to have with us two wonderful speakers. I will introduce the first one, Reverend James Bhagwan, who is from Fiji and currently serves as the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, which is the big ecumenical organization in the Oceania region, consisting of 33 member churches and 10 national councils of churches across 18 Pacific Island states and territories, comprising about 80% of the Pacific's human population. The PCC's key focus areas over the last 6 decades include ecumenism, political, economic, social, and cultural self-determination, including youth engagement and empowerment, child protection and gender justice, ecological stewardship, and climate justice. We're very, very glad to have Reverend James Bhagwan with us today.
And we're also very glad to welcome Dr. Svitlana Romanko, who is the co-founder of Stand With Ukraine campaign and coordinator. Svitlana is a green movement strategist and climate activist who holds a doctorate in environmental law, climate change law, climate governance, and climate policy. Previously, she worked for 350.org, Green Deal projects in Eastern Europe, and the Laudato Si movement. She is based in Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine. We're so glad you're with us, Svitlana.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's very important that Presbyterian Church of the US hears the voice of the people who suffer, and not only from Ukraine, but also from many other regions in the world. And I'm here to tell you a bit more about how war impacted, in general, Ukraine over these 3 months, because this have been 3 hideous and horrific months for us as Ukrainians and for the world, because it was for the first time when we were observing such a unimaginable war. We could never imagine as Ukrainians, because we considered Russia to be our neighboring country, and fueled by money from fossil fuel profits, from using oil, gas, and coal for many, many years, for enriching the elites, a few elites who then helped Putin to build his military buildup. And just here, one small reminder that Russia is the largest country in the world, one of the largest countries in the world, but definitely largest country in the continent, for the whole continent. And it has the largest reserves of oil and gas. Holding the second, before we started our campaign, Stand With Ukraine, Russia was holding the second and the third place in the world among the global exporters of oil and gas. So we see, they also have coal. So basically, they have unlimited resources for years. They led them to dictatorship, tyranny, and autocracy that we all have become a victim. But I would not even call us victims because we are fighting back and we are trying to fight for our independence, for our sovereignty, but also for breaking from fossil fuel addiction that feeds war in my country, conflicts in other parts of the world, especially in the global south, and also feeds injustice and inequality among those who are affected by our addiction to the fossil fuels. Just a few facts about Ukraine, what we've lived so far. Speaking on my personal experience, I live in the west of the country, but we at 5 a.m. we all woke up to explosions, even in our city. So there were massive explosions for the first day. And now 3 months we are in this war altogether, and more than 14.5 million Ukrainians fled their homes, while tens of thousands of civilians were killed. The Russian attacks completely destroyed cities like Mariupol in the south, Bucha in the north, and Popasna in the east of the country. Atrocities uncovered in territories that were under Russian occupation have all characteristics of genocide of Ukrainian people. And meanwhile, the Russian armed forces are still occupying and controlling parts of Kherson, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions, as well as Crimean Peninsula. And after 3 months of the full-scale war, infrastructure damages are enormous. 23,500 kilometers of roads, 621 kindergarten, 295 bridges, almost 1,000 of healthcare institutions and factories were bombed and destroyed. And Ukrainian GDP is expected to drop by 30, from 30 to 50% this year, as the cost of rebuilding of the country after the war is estimated as $4 trillion. This is a huge amount of money. In general, I just reminded another amount, which is 73 trillion of US dollars. This is exact numbers that the Stanford University had discovered for us and assessed the overall clean energy transition for the whole world, including Ukraine. And we see how the parts of this whole are making not a creation, but making a destruction of the territory. And this is also the huge impact of the war and effect of the war that we would like to avoid, of course. And there is also a huge environmental damage. Thousands of hectares of ecosystems have already been destroyed, and Russia targets our critical energy infrastructure like power lines, power plants, oil depots, as well as industrial facilities, including chemical plants and gas networks. Russia also occupied nuclear power plants, as you may probably know, of course, and they are existential threat to the whole nation, but even beyond, because overall, oil and gas provide around 40% of the Russian federal budget revenue and make up approximately 60% of Russian exports. And there is a clear correlation between Russian military spending and the revenue the country gets from fossil fuel exports. And we keep saying that climate crisis, war in Ukraine, energy insecurity crisis that we are in are all deeply rooted in fossil fuels. And fossil fuel wars and conflicts, they existed forever through all almost 200 years while we've been using coal, oil, and gas and burned them to cause the climate crisis and man-made climate crisis. I would say even more, the war against my country is a so-called man-made war. Putin started this war. He declared the war on Ukraine, and the same climate crisis is a very much man-made, but there are many of us, those who have been fossil fuel addicted, created this crisis altogether. So the solution lies at the very same place. For me, it's simple, because on the second day of war, with many activists on peace and justice and climate activists from Ukraine and all over the world, we organized for Stand With Ukraine campaign, which now is a coalition of 800 organizations in over 60 countries of the world, fighting to end fossil fuel addictions that feeds Putin's war machine. But as an imperative, all new exploration must be halted, and we cannot see the world responding on the crisis we are in, on the wars our country are in, on the climate crisis and energy crisis, by doubling down fossil fuel production. It's imperative that this must stop, and we are those who must stop this fossil fuel addiction. And what we've done so far, we called to a full ban of Russian oil, gas, and coal. And as we know, even now, this morning, there were news that the European Union finally imposed the embargo on oil, with a small exception for Hungary, for pipeline oil that will be transported by the end of the year. But more importantly, that we see weak but still political action towards phasing out fossil fuels. And this, of course, is a big step for us to continue and to move forward. Before that, the European Union imposed an embargo on coal, which makes not a significant part of Russian profit. It's it's $4 billion US dollars equivalent annually. So it's not that big. But of course, we understand that Putin's war chest must be tried, and his financial flows must be tried as soon as possible to stop this dreadful destruction of our country and many, many civilians, because it's truly we cannot imagine what is happening. And of course, we are being on the front line. It's very clear for us that change have to come, and fight for our freedom will and must lead us to what science has told us to do: stop burning coal, oil, and gas right now. And as for Ukrainian, it's very difficult for me that the planet-saving transition to clean energy might come finally at the costs that has been paid by my compatriots with their lives and the devastation of my country. But perhaps I live on the front line. I see clearly that this is a decisive point in modern history, and we can make the wrong turn back to fossil fuel colonialism, which we see started happening in the countries of the global south, but not only in Canada, in the US, in the UK, where fossil fuel companies were actively using what I call peace washing. It's a similar definition to greenwashing, but not to justify their attempts being green, but to justify their attempts to increase exploration of fossil fuels and say that we are helping Ukraine to overcome the war. No, that is not true. And especially for the US, I just look for some data when 20 main US fossil fuel companies have doubled their profits only for the first quarter of this year when the war started. They are looking for replacement of Russian fossil fuels. When we are saying, we climate and justice and peace activists, we are saying them, stop doing that. We have to phase out fossil fuels everywhere in the planet. Our war is extremely horrific. That's true, because we fight a very powerful enemy. But at the same time, we have all power, and we have a movemental power to end this war once and forever. This may be last war on the planet if we want to, and if we would quickly switch to clean energy transition, if we divert those financial flows that are still big banks and big financiers and insurers are holding tightly in their hands, in their comfortable offices, and they are saying that it's still profitable. We still need to fund the fossil fuel industry because that's profitable. That was where the money are, and I can say it's not true. And I just back from Total AGM meeting where I was present, and I had a chance to speak to Total AGM shareholders, and I have to say that they do realize that their money feed war and conflict, and this money for now they contain the blood of Ukrainian people, but also the people in Africa, where the new pipeline ECOP is going to be built through the many territories. Same people in Vaca Muerta, in Colombia, everywhere. The suffering looks the same everywhere, and we have to stop this. So doing that, to do it, how may we do that just now at this very moment? When I've been with Laudato Si movement, we were great partners with many other churches and Catholic institutions from all over the world, and I truly feel that this care for creation and prayer help us sometimes to overcome, like all the time, to overcome the most hard moments in our most difficult moments in our lives. But sometimes we can act immediately, and along with being praying and being supportive of many other brothers and sisters, we can act immediately. The first thing, which will be very right thing to do right now, completely divest from fossil fuels. It's about moral leadership and the moral and ethical choice that we all are making as a shareholders, yes, as asset holders, as a people who understand that very soon this fossil fueled money that feed war and conflicts around the world will become useless, will become a stranded assets, because money are useless on the dead planet. And I believe that this is very important, that everyone who is listening, institutions, healthcare institutions, basically everyone will rather spread the word or just will divest themselves from fossil fuels, because that's important. That's how we can help, you can help even our country to end the war, because if we all divest from fossil fuels, they will be bankrupt. And we can add this fossil fuel money, we can invest them into green technologies, into solar, wind, and clean energies that don't kill animals, that does not kill people, and won't, I believe, if we keep it community owned but not monopolized as has been done with fossil fuels. And lastly, I would like to say that it's also important, while you are providing a humanitarian help, of course, and while we are all taking care about those who have been internally displaced or have become refugees inside of Ukraine or outside from Ukraine. And I know that there is incredible global solidarity, and people donate money, they support those sufferings, and they try to help us to overcome this war as a humans. It's very important as well how we act politically and how we stay united, how we stay a climate movement, and how we tackle climate crisis and war crisis and energy crisis all together. So the next, I would like to end with the next step we can do on more political level, on the top level of countries, decision makers, big stakeholders, politicians. We can demand the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which will keep all fossil fuels in the ground. It's kind of a legal mechanism to, first of all, phase out fossil fuels. Second, commit to the non-proliferation and not to explore a new fields, as it has been hugely done right now, we see recently. And the third one, it's just and fast transition to a clean energy, which of course foresees and anticipates some investments, green investments made into this area. And I would like to encourage us everyone to start from a small step and think a bit more what I can do today to help to end the war in Ukraine, to end the conflict in Africa or in Latin America or in Canada, protesting against another pipeline and tar sands exploration as well. Everywhere everywhere the solidarity is hugely needed. And again, if we just say a word to our bankers, insurers, financiers, to our neighbors, to the institutions where we take care of ourselves, health institutions or universities, and our politicians stop using fossil fuels right now because they feed dictatorships like Putin, and they lead to the bloody wars as the war in Ukraine. But for my final note, I'm truly optimistic. Even being in the midst of these horrors, I keep being optimistic, and I'm deeply grateful for incredible global solidarity that has been expressed from many, many countries and regions in the world. And I hope that same bravely and consciously as we express the solidarity everywhere, we will be able to tackle a climate crisis and end fossil fuel addictions that feeds war and conflicts everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romanko, for being with us. It is a privilege and a blessing for us to see you, to hear your voice, to be with you in this solidarity, both in our prayers and our thoughts, but also, as you said, our actions, that we be politically engaged in both this climate crisis and this war crisis, that we not let these things go unattended and unresponded to. So we are so deeply grateful that you have taken time to be with us. Thank you so much. We will turn to hear from Reverend Bhagwan from Fiji, to hear a different part of the world, as Dr. Romanko was talking about global solidarity and how all of our struggles are linked together. And as we connect the dots between different issues such as war and militarism and climate change, we also connect the dots between human communities all over the world that are impacted. So we'll turn to you, Reverend Bhagwan, for your presentation, and then we will have some time together to have some conversation and question and answers together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just checking you can hear me. All good? All right.
Yes, all good.
I want to begin firstly by acknowledging Svitlana's presentation and her important sharing with us. And I hope that as I share a perspective from the Pacific, you will see some connections, because though we may be separated in terms of hemisphere, there's some very key issues that we are facing, and not in the least the call for, as she mentioned at the end, the fossil fuel non-proliferation and just and fast transition to clean energy. I think that's very important for us. But let me begin by saying I'm speaking from Fiji, which between 1987 and the year 2009 experienced between 4 to 5 military coups, depending on how you count. We have the Solomon Islands, which experienced ethnic tensions between 2000 and 2003. We have Bougainville, which went through a war over resources, a civil war over resources, in the 1990s, and is now awaiting independence following a referendum with Papua New Guinea. We have the island territories known to many people as French Polynesia, which we call Maui Nui, or Tahiti, for those who don't know the area, and New Caledonia, which we call Kanaki, which continue to struggle for independence from France. And of course, for us as PCC, the area known as West Papua, currently a province of Indonesia, but very much a Melanesian Pacific community. Those are the ongoing conflicts in our region. Some have finished, some continue under the guise of democracy, but have been imposed upon us. And some are outright ongoing massive human rights abuses that take place. But I want to perhaps I'll say this day, or at this moment, because we're all in different time zones. It is 4:30 in the morning here on Wednesday in Fiji. Just maybe do a little bit of context setting for us, and talk about my home, the Pacific. It's very different from the context in Russia and Ukraine, because we are the liquid continent, not the land continent. And we are the largest and deepest of the world's 4 oceans, covering more than a third of the Earth's surface and containing more than half of its free water. We have the most coral reef species in the world. 70% of the global fish catch comes from the Pacific Ocean. Our ocean regulates local and global weather and climate. And just looking at the diversity within the Pacific, 5,330 native plant species, 242 native bird species, native terrestrial reptiles, mammals, endemic native amphibians, and some 4,000 snail species, if you're into snails. That just shows the biodiversity. But we also have 2/5 of the total indigenous languages spoken in the world found in the Pacific. Yeah, it's approximately 1,200 languages. But despite all of that, and particularly looking at the huge contribution that the Pacific provides to this planet, both in terms of climate, in terms of resources, and in terms of biodiversity, the common view of the Pacific, this is what you'll find in most maps. And this is a very northern hemisphere or Western perspective of the world, I guess. And you will see that even in this map, the ocean, the Pacific, is split to east and west. That's how it's often seen. And it's often seen as, because of that, insignificant. But to give you an understanding of how big the Pacific is, let's see if I can get us back to that. You can see when we put the Pacific in the center, just how big it really is. And this is the context that I want to begin our conversation, because I mentioned all that biodiversity. I mentioned all those issues to remind us that this blue space that you see is not empty. It's full of life. And often from an anthropocentric or a human perspective, it looks empty. We often joke that that's why Pacific Islanders are usually so big, because there's so much space and so few of us. But if you look in the context of the life as creation, as Christians, as we see as part of creation, it is a hugely populated space. If we could fit all the continents of the rest of the world in our Pacific Ocean and still have room. That's how large we are. And so I want to begin this by saying that we are large ocean states. But these ocean states are under threat. And at the moment, it's interesting that maps divide. On maps you have divisions of latitude and longitude. And if you colored in every odd space, every odd square, it would look like a chessboard. Now, this is the primary conflict that we see in the Pacific. The Pacific is actually currently a geopolitical chessboard. And perhaps while a lot of attention is placed, and rightly so, to what is happening in Europe with the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and I'm very grateful for the way that Svitlana articulated this around oil and around fossil fuels. We have the similar situation in the Pacific. The Pacific is already, as I mentioned, apart from our internal conflicts that have taken place over the last few decades, we are also the only region to be severely affected by the nuclear legacy. We still have the ongoing impacts of nuclear testing that took place from the end of World War II right up until 1996. So 50 years of nuclear testing taking place, which puts the explosions in the use of the nuclear weapons in Japan during World War II into a very small space, considering how many tests have been done. And we still see that impact today. So the ongoing legacy of global conflict in the Pacific. We have a leaking dome in Runit, the Runit Dome in Enewetak Atoll in the northern part of the Pacific in the Marshall Islands. This dome is where they did the testing, you know, the names Bikini Atoll, etc. This is the northern Pacific, and the nuclear waste is still there, leaking from the dome into the ocean. We have in Maunganui, or French Polynesia, the atolls that include Mororoa, where the French tested their nuclear weapons, and that atoll is cracked, slowly leaking nuclear waste into our region. And of course, Kiribati and Australia were other places where nuclear testing occurred. I include Australia in this conversation because they are part of the Pacific Islands Forum, along with New Zealand, although as we see, they're actually a very significant player in the geopolitical chess game that we are seeing. Having said that context of the legacy, I want to say that for most of us in the Pacific, that earlier view of that empty space around all the continents is the way that we often are treated. We have very little agency when it comes to addressing things at a global level. And so we now see in our region the new Cold War taking place. And this new Cold War, for those of you who may not be aware, is known as the Indo-Pacific Strategy, particularly led by the United States against China, where China is seen as the aggressor, aggressively coming into the Pacific with using trade, using aid to set up, supposedly to have security agreements with Pacific Island countries. And you have the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, Japan, and India on the other side. There's also France that is drawn into this conflict in a way because of its territories, its colonial hold on French Polynesia and New Caledonia as well. Just to give you an example of how this works, and you're welcome to read about how China is impacting around the world, in fact, using aid as a method of colonial expansion. But just in the last week, there was a flurry of basically cat and mouse chase taking place, where the Chinese foreign minister was traveling through the Pacific, and the Australian foreign minister was trying to get to places where the Chinese foreign minister hadn't already got to try and offer rival partnerships and rival expressions of support and being part of this broader community space. And most recently, the Solomon Islands is the first Pacific Island country to sign a development and security pact with China. And that comes in the wake of strong intervention by both the United States and Australia to try and hold the Solomon Islands back from that. So in this context, before we even get to the climate crisis, this is what's going on right now in our region. And that is because the Pacific is the final frontier when it comes to resource extraction. It's important to note here that while we are moving away from fossil fuels, we still have other areas of resource extraction that are going to be taking place and may affect the structure of our planet, particularly from the role of the oceans, and I'll come to that later. But we see within the struggle for self-determination and under the issue of conflict, the ongoing struggles that our Pacific territories face. France does not want to give up French Polynesia, Maunganui, or Kanaki, New Caledonia, because it adds to their their regional and global security. It is also an important marine resource. As I mentioned earlier, the 70% of the world's global tuna and fish come from the Pacific. And that's also a reason that China is interested in our area. We also have mining with one of the world's largest copper mines in New Caledonia, which is still an important source of revenue. So these things continue to take place. In Indonesia, in West Papua, we still have Indonesian control. For those of you who are in the US, Freeport Mining and others are heavily invested in West Papua. The Grasberg mine is the world's largest open pit gold mine. And just recently, Elon Musk, who is being touted for his environmental wokeness in some ways, and all the work that SpaceX is doing, is negotiating with Indonesia for a West Papuan island to be cleared of people. They will have internal displacement, no control, no free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous communities, to put a SpaceX base, rocket launching base there. So these are the ongoing conflicts. We still have, of course, Australia heavily invested in coal, and that is the major coal manufacturer in the Pacific, an exporter of coal to China and other places. In our regional outlook, when we talk about climate change, we usually say that just around 1.4% of the world's global carbon emissions come from the Pacific. But I need to acknowledge here that 1.3% of that 1.4 comes from Australia alone, with around 0.5% or so from New Zealand, and then the 0.000s coming from the rest of the Pacific put together. So in this context, we still, again, see the resource wars taking place. In all of that context, we have the issue of climate justice, where, as many people know already, the Pacific is one of those countries on the forefront of the impacts of rising sea levels, of ocean acidification. And so in the context of security, we have the issues of traditional security, as I've mentioned earlier, in terms of all that is happening in this new geopolitical activity taking place in the Pacific. But then there are the broader peace and security, climate intersections that take place. Around resources, we understand that is the key issue. And we also have the issue of climate-induced displacement. As our smaller islands or our coral atolls within the region become inhospitable, we are already seeing communities relocating internally. Some have the option to move to their own land on higher ground, but there are many communities that do not have land to move to. And that will then add to the issue of external migration, or as we say, climate-induced displacement and migration. And there's a whole conversation now happening around what does a Pacific climate change, migration, and human security framework look like? So we're already having those conversations of people who will have to be uprooted and move to not just another island in their country, but actually move to other countries. So those are things that we are keeping in mind. The other non-traditional security issue for us is, of course, the issue of food security within the situation of saltwater inundation, making planting difficult for coral atolls, the impact of extreme weather patterns such as cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, but also floods and droughts. So we're on that cusp of the extreme weather patterns that are impacting us as a result of climate change. And then finally, coming back to the final frontier of the ocean. In the context of all that we face, the ocean is seen as an important resource as people move away to cleaner energies. And so when we're talking about just transitions, we're also trying to be very careful as to how natural resources are being developed or extracted. And our biggest concern at the moment is where a deep sea mining or seabed mining takes place under the context of finding resources for clean energy. And we are starting to see a lot more activity in our Pacific region. And so maybe to conclude for us, as we go through all the human security aspects in our region, I want to conclude with the ocean, because as I said, the Pacific Ocean is one of those key regulators of the climate. The regulation of currents, the movements of heat in our planet, and the dissipation of that heat through the ocean is significant. And we are very conscious that the amount of oxygen that is now produced by our oceans, and should deep sea mining move forward, this will pose further threats and further impacts to the climate crisis as we face it today. Once again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to questions. Naka.
This has been so incredible again. Thank you, Reverend Bhagwan, both of you so much. We really appreciate your presentations as they show how in two very different regions, still how war and violent conflict and militarism really affect all of creation, as you said, all of life, not just humanity. And sharing how those energy systems, schools, hospitals, water systems, food security, biodiversity are all impacted, and they're attacked by war and conflict and undone by militarism, leaving all those scars for natural as well as social systems. So I think we all really resonate that in addition to the active war and violent conflict, there are all these things, as you said, about nuclear testing and nuclear waste that is leaking, that's coming and emerging as a form of militarism and climate change, the mining and resource extraction. We here, as you all may know, in Honolulu, Hawaii, had the military jet fuel storage on Red Hill that had a massive leak. So I was reminded of that from a year and a half ago, where both military and non-military families, nearly 100,000 people, have no drinking water because of that leak. So I just think we're seeing this echoed all around the world. We did want to note for our audience that as we do these conversations as the militarism working group, we aren't separating out military personnel or military over and against each one of us who's implicated in climate change and who's a consumer of the earth. So we move forward together. We're all part of systems. We all bear responsibility. So we're not pointing fingers or casting blame while we distance ourselves from implication. We recognize, even in the US context, that there are some aspects in which the US military's recognized sea level rise, talked about climate change, adapting facilities, adding renewable energy, and talking about climate change as a major security risk. So we did just want to note that there is some of that beginning to happen. But there are all these huger phenomena, as you both talked about so eloquently, where we really want to explore this intersections. So really appreciate all you shared. For those listening, we'll turn to questions and answers. If there are additional questions from folks attending, if you would please put those in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And I wanted to invite James and Svitlana also, if you have questions for one another, or if there was something in each other's presentations that you wanted to engage more, we welcome you to do that. Also, if you have your own question. But let me start us off and just ask if you would consider having kind of a main goal around which you wish people would unite in order to create a better world. What would that goal be? You both said a number of things, but just kind of clarifying once again, reiterating, what might a main goal be that you would invite people to unite around?
I think just jumping in quickly before Svitlana, there's something she shared at the end, and for us in the Pacific that resonates when we talk about the focus and shifting the focus of understanding prosperity or development, not from an economic perspective, but from a well-being perspective. And understanding, and that's why, you know, even in our introduction, we say that PCC represents the human population, representative of the human population. We have to recognize, and I think our role as Christians is very important, our integral relationship with the rest of creation, and looking for ways in which our development impacts well-being. In the Pacific, we call that the process of reweaving the ecological mat, you know, taking out those toxic strands that have been imposed on us by colonialism in the past and neo-colonialism in the present. And I think that's one of the things that for us from the Pacific is very important. How do we really articulate and show our relationship with creation? And as I mentioned earlier, what Svitlana said also around you know, pushing for the non-proliferation of fossil fuels. I think that's something for us as the Pacific. We've heard about this. We've been invited to support that, and that's what we are planning to do. But particularly as she's also articulated. Sorry, Svitlana, for taking your words. I acknowledge that, but that's because it's important. The just and fast transition. In the Pacific, as you see, because we're an ocean-based continent, if that's a way, or region, you know, as Oceania, the need for us to travel between our islands requires fossil fuel, and we have very little support for sustainable sea transport, and so the call for just transitions needs to be just as loud as the call to end the use of fossil fuel. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, James. I completely agree with you, and that again proves that we are in solidarity with each other, being on the Fiji Islands, on Pacific Islands, when I know that people that are really it's very much climate unjust what you are facing in the Pacific. Yes, consuming less and but paying by disasters and many in many other ways. So my would be to restore the global justice, and echoing James what you said. Yes, it's about as well dismantling probably the old economic and political system and building a new one on the basis of a green transition, fast and just, clean energy transition. And for me, it will be personally energy that does not fit anyone's war machines against peaceful civilians and towards destruction. I would definitely make a call, and I am making it right now, towards global justice, global climate justice, global social justice, economic justice, but simply the world justice. It has such a powerful sound in so many meanings, for which I believe are similar for many of us living in different conditions, in the war or in the conflict, and in many affected places and areas. And I truly believe that what we do next, what we do in the next 6 months, we don't have a lot of time to think or just decide a lot. We need to act fast and act now. It will define our future. It's truly a decisive moment, because fighting the biggest fossil fuel monster, I would say, the country who is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, the country who for years oppressed another people, as I am in Ukraine, and as my ancestors and many, many more. So if we will be able to stop one dictator, I believe some others that are trying to prop up in Saudi Arabia or in somewhere in Brazil or somewhere in Asia, we all know in the Philippines, and many other places, they are watching closely. Would we let this happen as a humanity, or we will overcome this and become better and just make this world a better place, a place of change? And I believe in the second. I believe in the second option, in justice, and that we all win finally. But we only have few months to act because we have a huge window, open window of opportunities. It very much compared with the price, not in compared with the price that we are all paying. I cannot compare those things, but yeah, it's, as I said, hard for me to recognize that the lives and the destruction of my country may be that price, but we still have time to wake up and act accordingly. And divestment, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and community energy transition, green revolution, I would just say, even green revolution, because it should be fast and furious and immediate. And this is how we can add these fossil fuel dominances that put us all in the circumstances and conditions that we are now. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. We have one question from our participant who's reflecting on the connection between both of your presentations on the role of empire, whether it's the modern day war and invasion in Ukraine by Russia, or the lingering colonialism you talked about, James, by several nations, including our own, both being military endeavors that have these climate impacts. What would each of you say to those of us who are associated with empire nations with huge military budgets, is the question.
Go for it, go for it, Svitlana.
Resist towards your politicians and rise up towards the politicians and make them towards a good action, because especially in the US, in Canada, in many other countries, and you can support us greatly being there, absolutely, and just being very, very resilient and resistant to existing political system, and demand more, always demand more than we can. For example, what we can do right now, don't let the legislation that puts increasement of fossil fuel exploration to be adopted, for example, somewhere in the US, or just these natural reserves being used and justified for fossil fuel companies as the only source to help or to save humanity and to help Ukraine as well and other countries in the conflict. No, because fossil fuels are conflicts. They are the weapon of mass destruction, and we have to acknowledge this. We sort of think that climate crisis is obviously a weapon of mass destruction because it's been somewhere stated in an economic summit in Davos, and it's one of the huge risks, the main risk of the climate crisis. But at the same time, we see that fossil fuels have equally become a weapon of mass destruction, literally becomes a weapon of mass destruction. And just to provide a few numbers, because I've seen, I did have some data as well to share on the webinar, because they shocked me when I first heard them. So the European Union still sends 1 billion euros each day, daily, paying for Russian oil and gas. Each day, enormous amount of money is feeding Putin's war machine. But Putin spends exactly 900,000 millions US dollars each day to run the war in my country. So this is a very simple math. Those of you who are in the EU countries, help us towards the embargo on oil and gas. Today it was announced just as a finally, after over the months of the war, that probably there will be an oil embargo. but with a phasing out until the end of this year. And we still have some countries that are actively importing oil, and specifically oil, as India, as South Korea, as Japan started doing that. And they use some advantages on their lower prices and discounts from fossil fuels. It's not easy. We didn't expect it to be easy, because we've been creating these, and these regimes have been developing over the hundreds of years. But we are that ambitious to think that we can defeat those regimes and defeat fossil fuels and phase out of them in a few months. That's a top ambitious goal, but more seriously, with some transition time. But we can do that. Of course we can. And transition to a clean energy, investment into clean energy. I think after we had a very deep conversation with you, and thank you so much for this conversation. I think that after this conversation, I would, if I maintain some assets in fossil fuel industry, I would be hugely ashamed that, honestly, just saying this word, that I'm still just not making appropriate moral and ethical choice, and I finance literally the weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
I think just to add, it's important for us to understand, in terms of, we use the term mats and strands sometimes to remind ourselves how connected we are to things. And that last point that was made by Svitlana around divestment, I think that's very, very important, because a lot of us don't recognize where some of our money is invested, whether it is our for us, as we say, superannuation, our retirement funds, the different investment portfolios we hold, and where those companies are investing in. And I think that's one of the biggest things, because our voice is important, but also how we spend our money is important. And that's the personal shift that we need to make, how we choose where we spend our funds. The cost of importation of products. What are those products that we are buying that adds to the fossil fuel industry, because they use fossil fuel to be imported. So it's even those small choices that we make add up to the bigger choices, and ultimately it's where we choose and where you choose to spend your dollar. That's one. The secondly is our role as Christians. And I think, again, I come back to, recognizing that there is a wide diversity of Christian faith in the United States. And some of them do not think about the world as we do. How do we encourage them to become part of this? How do we ensure that we are shifting the thinking? And I think that's the biggest challenge, because otherwise things are already done just for the moment, and then everybody retreats to that comfort zone, which is unfortunately not good for the rest of the planet and for our own experience. And I think it's important to recognize what the impacts of the climate crisis are on every community. It's very good to look at the Pacific, but the Pacific can also be seen as far away. The Australian communities woke up to bushfires, and then they started to realize that bushfires and the extreme weather patterns that they're experiencing is a result of climate change. And that helped a lot in the conversations. So localizing some of these issues is very, very important as well. Thank you.
Thank you. This is just also wonderful. We've got a couple more questions from Eileen, Bruce, and Ben. So I'm gonna ask these three questions, and hopefully we'll have gotten through our various questions. One question is understanding that the US military is the largest single consumer of fossil fuels in the US. And imagining that other militaries are equally hungry for fossil fuels, to what extent do you think the world's militaries are actually standing in the way of climate action, that they're actively kind of preventing or wanting to fight climate change so that they can continue kind of fighting more wars?
Yeah, the military-industrial complex continues unabated. And again, we need to recognize that all of this comes down to economics and business. And I think that's the challenge we face, and that's the challenge you face, because we are on the receiving end of all of this. You know, the amount of energy currently being spent, human energy, mental energy being spent by the United States government on the Pacific because of China. And we see the shift and the movements that take place in our region. I think this is something that we need to pay attention to. How do you challenge that industrial complex? And again, I say it comes back to the economic factor. The answer that's always given is defense of the country, jobs, all those sorts of things. And so you need to grapple and wrestle with how you respond in that. What are the alternatives? And I think that's the key to it, you know, shifting away from an economic understanding to a more ecological understanding and the value of ecology. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And I see, Svitlana, I think maybe you are trying to answer a question from Bruce. So thank you for that. Bruce had asked about a good article connecting the war in Ukraine and some ways to address climate change here in the US that could be shared with churches. So if you want to see the Q&A box on your Zoom, you can go to that and see some of the conversations, as well as the link that Svitlana just put down there. So thank you so much for that. A question from Eileen is, could either of you comment on some of the challenges that we see about moving towards green energy? James had mentioned mining, open pit mining for gold and other resource extraction. We're becoming aware of some of our green energy technologies are reliant on mining rare earth metals. So do either of you have thoughts about, as we move forward towards green energy, what might some challenges be, and how might we be engaged or counter those?
Svitlana, would you like to answer that? I can give a response after.
Yes, I can answer. So I would answer this not from this perspective. Yes, I have probably, I'm not a specialist in the specifically raw materials area, but I do understand the problem, of course. I do understand that clean technology still needs to be developed and assessed towards some environmental impacts, but that's what we have so far. We have to use raw materials to produce some batteries, but I think that the technology will be available soon to not to consume that resources as well as much. What to say? I don't believe actually that this amount of consumption will replace the fossil fuels and the greenhouse gas emissions, huge climate chaos that we are in. But of course, this needs to be explored more. I would like just to say a few another statements that I just also have for now, that the world for now, it's a fossil fuel exit strategy report released last year by Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the world has enough renewable energy potential even now to make the transition to a clean energy. But of course, some investments are needed. To some data, I've met different numbers, and the number from IEA, International Energy Agency, says that we need to triple our investments, or even 4 times, and later number is 4 times increase our investments into clean energy. But even I've seen somewhere in the open sources that we are 6 times behind of investments that are needed into a clean energy transition. So the more investments we will have in a clean energy, the more research we will be able to do towards as well as the materials and how we can replace with some synthetic materials. But of course, as a humanity, as the last point I would like to make, we cannot, we are using resources, but we have to be very careful of how we are using those resources and use them in a manner that is called a zero environmental security risk. It's never a zero risk. In fact, it's a risk that tends to be zero. So I encourage all to think about this kind of environmental security risk that tends to zero, the minimum harms that we can create on the planet. Of course, we are leaving some traces, we consume products, but we have to minimize our impact on environment and of course, phase out fossil fuels, because what we did is it's a total destruction. I mean, in terms of burning fossil fuels and the consumption altogether, and yes, to get the climate justice in place.
Just to add, Rebecca, I was at COP26 in Glasgow. A long journey from the Pacific, just after borders opened. Had to have a rat test every morning to get into the venue for the meetings. And I was surprised that we still see governments being so blatantly supported by the fossil fuel industry that they themselves are subsidizing. So I think that's the first thing, is ending those subsidies. And we were all very disappointed when phase out became phase down on the fossil fuel issue, but also to see nuclear energy being promoted as an option for clean energy. When we in the Pacific, we understand the impact of when the nuclear issue goes wrong, what happens to nuclear waste. As we speak, we're trying to figure out how to stop Japan from dumping its so-called treated water into the Pacific Ocean after the Fukushima crisis and the meltdown at their nuclear reactor. And we say that if it's safe enough for them to drink, as they are saying, why don't they just drink it themselves or pour it into their own land? These are the things that we face. But I think just on the question of the challenges, particularly around rare earth metals, and that's why I alluded to the issue of seabed mining, because right now there's just not enough known. And we are asking countries, we're asking industry to apply the precautionary principle. Be very, very careful before jumping into this thing. And the fact that we wonder that the fact that our islands may become uninhabitable and there'll be all this empty ocean space, whether that's another way of getting access to the seabed. We find that a number of climate vulnerable countries are slowly opening up to seabed mining as a way of getting money in, because they can't exploit the land, so they move down to the sea. But just the impact of what that will do on the environmental services provided by the ocean to the planet. And so the idea is you want to reduce existing carbon emissions. You want to prevent or really minimize any new possibilities, but you've also got to maintain the integrity of the planet, the natural environment. Otherwise, the equation will go off. And so these are some things that we in the Pacific are wrestling. But the key thing for us as Pacific Islanders is to ensure that we have agency in this. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share our views and our context, so that we can continue to try and have some agency in these rather global conversations.
Yeah, that's really important. Very helpful, both of you. I think we'll have one more question and then say goodbye as we continue to stand in solidarity and action together. Someone sent a direct question to us. as pastors, how can we convey the urgency of the message about this connection between climate change and violence in the world, but without causing despair? So how do we convey this message in a way that leads to action and enough hope that gets people moving, but also being very realistic about where things are? What would each of you say to that as we close? How do you manage that?
For the Pacific churches, we were able to reflect on our perspective as a household, the oikos, being part of that community that is both human and non-human. And I think also in this sense, we are fortunate because we still have a very strong connection with our indigenous culture and our indigenous spirituality. I think that's also a challenge in the United States, where your indigenous community are so marginalized. But these are the things that you need to reflect on: the healing of your land, or the land on which you live, and the self-determination, the liberation of your indigenous people. You cannot talk about the rest of the world if you're not doing that at home. And I'll be honest to say, it's easy to look at other places than to start at home. And so I think those small steps, you begin with your communities, and then you move further out, but it's loving your neighbor, and recognizing that creation is your neighbor as well. You're not separate from it. You are, or not apart from it, you are a part of it. And I think that's where we begin, right? By renewing that relationship. I often wonder why the season of creation is only for 1 month. Yeah, season of creation should be 12 months. That's the orientation we should have. And you know, I think there's a lot of resources available in our faith traditions, in the Bible, from which we can draw. And you know, even the concept of Jubilee for the earth, Jubilee for the community. This is something that we looked at particularly around developing countries and debt, but we also need to apply the context of Jubilee to our communities and to the planet on which we live. Thank you.
Svitlana, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on how to message the urgency and dire situation, but without causing despair.
Oh, yes, I do know that. I do know that. First of all, we are moving on. Just in any circumstances, we are trying to find the best ways to help make a change where we are in, and what we can do. We can be, I would say, courageous all the time, even if we are doing some steps that we don't usually used to, or as we are in some kind of unusual circumstances, as for example war and conflict. Of course, it's hard to stay always like positive and feel that way. What's more importantly, but I think that moment of reflection, moment of solidarity, moment of feeling being part of the movement, of the big movement, climate movement, justice movement, and connecting to other people helps a lot to overcome this. And of course, mainly helps when you see the difference that you are making and the power that we all can make and the change that we all can be a part of, that we have a say, that we can change the current political and economical and all other systems, and we can be a difference, and because we are people power, and it doesn't really matter what we do for life for a moment, or where we are, but more importantly, what values we share. And of course, For the last year, I've been with Laudato Si movement, and we are staying good friends with them. And this moment, spirituality and prayer and taking care of creation and each other that we have in the church and beyond, it's very important for us to have and to provide support those who feel themselves in a grief or in sufferings as each other. So let's fight together, let's live together alone and live in all the wars and conflicts, especially those that are fueled by fossil fuels and all others behind.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you both. Svitlana, I know it's what, almost 8:30 in Ukraine right now. James, you've been awake, before 4 a.m. I don't know how you manage to be so sharp at this time of the day. Thank you so much. This webinar was really, really deep, and you really helped us, to gain strength, confidence as we're pursuing, this struggle for a clean planet, for a clean environment. I think your voice also were added to a lot of voices that we're hearing from partners in different parts of the world. How, a lot of our country, diversity, culture, are, often perceived by investors as wealth, as investment and extraction versus, a home, food, and life for wildlife and for people. You really help us, to see how, arms, sales, wars, nuclear waste, nuclear testing, how they very often destroy people, but they also really destroy the planet. And at the end, how millions of ordinary people, they're always the one paying the heavy price of these so-called cold wars that destroy their economies and food system and force them away from their land. I think something that I took away as well was, you challenge us to rethink also what development really means. Can we really have real development if that's done by destroying creation? And you left us really encouraged to see, the importance of global solidarity, global justice, resistance, and divestment in many situations. Your voices and you coming together from two different contexts, it was just amazing to see how, again, we see exactly the same patterns everywhere, and how important it is to dismantle unjust systems and rebuilding new ones. And by demanding more, as Svitlana said, more, always demanding more and rethinking where we spend our money. And we're also feeling as, ordinary people, like as there's something to do. James was talking about really looking at where we live and also looking at how locally we can get involved. So this culture of violence that we've been talking about, all through this webinar, that kills people, destroy the planet, is really global. And we believe that coming together as people of God to name them and to look for ways to organize together for change is really essential. So really, really from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. Thank you for all those who were able to attend today. Rebecca has shared a couple of links from PC USA that could help us also to further this conversation. And very soon, the next series of webinars from the Militarism group will be announced. But again, thank you so much for today, and have a great evening. And a good day, James. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.